There's a vice chancellor, which I won't mention by name because I'm not in a mood to be confrontational today, nor controversial. And another leader of a university somewhere in the Eastern Cape, sitting on a hill, very small university, who said, hey, but this free education will lower the quality, man. That's why Mafule is saying we must question people's academic commitment and their commitment to academia. Because at no stage that the fact that my tuition fee is paid by the government and not my parent ever have anything to do with the quality of the delivery of the content. Sometimes some of the people who say free higher education will lead to a decline in quality are themselves beneficiaries of a bursary or a scholarship which they never had to pay back, which is, by the way, another version of free higher education. So it does not only expose the inefficiency in their grasp of the discipline they might be in, but it also exposes the hypocrisy which is inherent in those who occupy dominant positions in all institutions. And it's important to talk about the dominance in higher education, because dominance in higher education is actually a conduit or a proxy for domination in society. Now, the songs have come to an end. Without wasting any time, what is the problem statement, since we are talking about the Center for Emerging Researchers, Mafule? The problem statement is that if the ladder of educational opportunity rises high at the doors of some youth and scarcely rises at the doors of others, while education is made a formal prerequisite for any form of occupational or social advance, then that education becomes a means of reproducing racial and class inequality and not of eradicating them. That is the problem statement. In fact, that quote was said in the early 1947, late 1940s, or 1947 to be more precise. And it was at the time when America and other countries were coming from war, and there were a lot of unemployed and unemployable war veterans. So countries which subscribed to capitalism took a decision that when it comes to education, this is an instrument of redressing a post-war situation. Please keep the words post-war in your mind when we proceed. But quite interestingly, by 1948, South Africa becomes an apartheid state. And that apartheid state adopts education policy as an instrument of racial and class domination as well. So people have always known for a long time, if you want to dominate anybody, limit their access to education. Of course, there are different definitions of what education is. But that knowledge which becomes a barrier or an enabler to a better life is blockaded by the oppressor, and those dominated become servants or reproducers of cheap labor, like in South Africa. It should therefore go without saying that if we are serious about a racial and class reconciliatory transition, we ought to radically open the doors of learning. And really, there was a lot of myth. Hey, free education is from this guy and that guy. No, it's that guy. We question those people's commitment to academia. Because countless policy documents demanded free higher education before Chivumo's mom and my mom were even born. It is therefore chronologically impossible for Chivumo to be the originator of a free higher education policy. I think let's clarify that one. So where does it come from in South Africa? I won't go too far back to when people took our land. I'll leave that part for another discussion. I'll just start at the Freedom Charter. I just want to give background or the basis upon which I'll be making claims that I will make, so that it's not just my opinion, but it's based on empirical evidence and facts of history, and of course facts moving forward. We start with the Freedom Charter that says, higher education and technical training shall be open for all by means of state allowances and scholarships awarded on the basis of merit. Sometimes when people talk about free education and the poor, they speak as though the poor do not go through the same admission system as those who paid. It's almost like people are doing us a favor. And that is not the sad part. The devastating part is that we believe them. And most of us, when we arrive at these institutions, we behave as though someone is doing us a favor. Like your neighbor who came to watch TV. You can make him wash his feet, send him to buy food, and so on. He will go there because he feels the mere fact of being in front of TV, it's you doing him a favor. So Africans enter these institutions of higher learning in the country of their birth and succumb to what is essentially low self-esteem from the oppressor. Any oppressor worth his salt will not be afraid of the oppressed, unless if the oppression is based on his low self-esteem and fear of the oppressed in the first place. 76, comrades, was not about Afrikaans. Let's clarify that part as well. 1976 was not about abolishing Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. Afrikaans, the language, was a symbol of a socially, politically, emotionally, historically, culturally abusive system of higher education and therefore society. So students took Afrikaans as a center of their attention, but what they were really fighting was the structuring of South African society as a whole, and not even just the education system alone. But here is where the story gets interesting, DVC. Professor Bengu, 1997, in a white paper on higher education, says, the post-apartheid South Africa has identified education as a strategic tool to reverse 300 years of colonialism and 45 years of apartheid. You stop there. Once you task education and bestow on it a historic and supreme task to reverse 345 years of structured economic, social, and political oppression, it's no longer some budget line you tick every budget speech. It's no longer an ordinary expense. In fact, you have imposed a retrospective responsibility on it, and therefore you must cost it going backwards and going front. Not now where you say in the next 3 years, how much will it cost me? No. You have imposed on it a job like none other. But most importantly, a country that goes to war is willing to pay the highest price. So if education in South Africa is tasked with reversing the socio-economic legacy of a war-like period, I'm sure colonialism and apartheid was worse than war. But anyway, let's call it war for now. It means you are willing to pay the highest price for it. It therefore cannot be looked at through narrow budgetary lens. Hey, can we afford it? Is it affordable? Sustainable? Where's the money going to come from? Yeah. Very, very funny things have happened in the past 3 years. But selling education to Africans in South Africa, it's like sending soldiers to war and say, but pass by here to buy the gun. We are fighting the apartheid regime, we are fighting colonialism, but please, there's a man standing over there selling grenades and AK-47s for you to fight. It's a politically retarded stance. So you can't sell it. People talk about Polokwane. Polokwane conference was the first time free education made its way into a policy resolution. But by 2012 in Mangaung, it had not been implemented yet. So Mangaung says, finalize this policy by 2013, implement it by 2014. That doesn't happen. Fees must fall starts in 2015. I want chronology now. So when somebody comes with a frivolous interpretation of where fees must fall came from, or free education came from, we can be able to give them a chronology of events. That's what these leaders ought to do moving forward, and not just to education, but any other policy moving forward. Fees must fall. Here is the stance, and I'm going to say this for the first time. As a youth member of the African National Congress, I saw fees must fall in two ways. One, as a legitimate demand for a long overdue promise. But two, I saw fees must fall as a protest against my movement's failure to honor its promise. And therefore, a job of a youth leaguer was not to compete on who can best ventilate what is wrong with the education system, but to hold the mother body by its throat until it implements, or we all die. Someone was saying, hey, President Zuma left a time bomb for Cyril Ramaphosa. Hey, this thing is going to be costly. False in a number of grounds. One, as far as I know, President Cyril Ramaphosa has himself been taking students for free for a very long time. Some of the early beneficiaries of TF, you were funded by Shanduka Foundation, for your information, and the JZ Foundation, and many other foundations of leaders who are said today are anti-free education. I will tell you how the narrative comes about. But number two, President Ramaphosa does not implement his thoughts. He implements policy resolutions. But number three, in my village, what has happened for President Ramaphosa is called a square pass. Imagine 3 years of fire on campus, going into a 4th year just before elections, with young people constituting 65% of the electorate. Fees must fall had generated a legitimate wave of concerns. But here's an issue with a legitimate wave of concerns, or a wave of legitimate concerns, sorry. A wave of legitimate concerns can be ridden by anyone. Even de Klerk could lead Fees must fall, and we would follow him, because the wave he was riding was much more important than how evil he is. So you did not have to throw police on the students, because that's a securitized response to a socio-economic demand, which is your own manifesto. That's a job application out of power. So the only way you could address the Fees must fall challenge was to translate the ANC's free higher education policy from rhetoric to practice. And Msholozi did that. The myth that former president needs anybody to understand free education is out of ignorance of who the man is in the first place. But anyway, what was wrong with the higher education system in the first place? I think we must be able to do this, because it shouldn't happen, Bob Sam, that there's a Thusanani student wearing a semi t-shirt who can't unpack what and why and hows of free higher education. It can't happen. That will be an embarrassment. I asked vets and UJ Thusanani fellows before I went back to school, I said, I'm worried about your late arrival to a meeting. How sure am I that when we take on real wars, you will even be there? I was not joking. I knew there was a war coming between beneficiaries of the status quo and those who are saying it's enough. But if you don't grasp the fundamentals of why we are fighting, you will end up fighting yourself. Because you don't know. The problem, therefore, was that despite the historic and supreme task of reversing the legacy of 345 years of structured economic, political, and social apartheid, a post-1994 neoliberal myth presided the commodification of higher education into something that can be bought and sold. That was the start of the problem. That becomes devastating. When Prof is talking about the fourth industrial revolution, that becomes devastating when there are more law firms going up than factories in South Africa. In other words, your economy is increasingly service-based and therefore demanding higher education skills as a prerequisite to just earn a living. Factories that require semi-skilled and therefore not going to university are closing down. So the structure of the South African economy demanded a rush towards post-schooling qualification in order to meet the demands, but also to ensure that when a factory closes, at least you can come up with a chemical to wash someone's shoes like Mutango. But Chivumo and I went to Judge Hare in that commission. We went to present to the commission because we realized that students, after being shot at, arrested, thrown on the ground, kicked out of universities, outsourced the process of coming up with a solution to so-called experts. Now let's come to that. What is an expert? An expert is someone who calls himself an expert or found somebody to call himself an expert. I mean, how do you know? I mean, if a guy studies 4 PhDs, staying in his room somewhere in deep rural Stekspruit, he's sitting there. He studies 1 PhD online, another PhD online. He communicates via Skype with his professor and so on. He's stuck in Stekspruit there. Is he an expert? You don't know. How would you know if he called himself one or somebody called him one? So students, after fighting a gruesome battle, in my absence, by the way, outsourced thinking to thieves. And I'll unpack why I'm saying consultants and so-called experts are thieves. You will understand the lowdown. I know you haven't read the 750 pages anyway. I know you have not read the 750 pages because one victory of free higher education was stolen during the budget speech and not a single one of you picked it up. Yeah, it was stolen by putting the words from 2018 onwards. Those words stole away from President's pronouncement that packages allocated to existing returning students from their second year onwards will be converted from loans to grants. What is a package? A package is what you are awarded when you enroll, which means in your third year, your second and first year loan ought to be converted to a grant. But you are being told by a registrar or a registration officer, sorry, you qualify for free education, but you can't register because of last year's debt. How? Why would government in its right state of mind say, you now have free education, comrades, you just have to pay the debt of last year? Why would government do that? The president spelled it out on the statement, but you read the tweets about the president's statement, not the president's statement. From defenders of the status quo, so you outsourced thinking about your livelihood. But at the heart of the crisis was a higher education system that is grossly underfunded, small in size, increasingly commodified, and unfairly meritocratic. Let's unpack those 4 stages. Thank you, Chief. When you say a higher education system is commodified, you don't just mean it's being bought and sold, that's obvious. But you are saying the cost of studying is not protected from market pressures. In other words, it costs more to live and eat in Braamfontein than to study at UJ. So why don't you stop saying you study at UJ and live in Braam and just say, I live and eat in Braam and happen to go to UJ? Because what brings you to Braam costs more than what happens at UJ. So when you say it's commodified, you mean it's subjected to slum landlords and dining hall catering cartels who take up over 60% of the full cost of study in the first place. So he says commodified. The apartheid regime would, I think, subsidize about 80% of student accommodation at the time. So it was not that commodified then.